Yes. First of all, I do apologise on behalf of the City Council for the small delay. We were just waiting to be able to get quorums. Welcome everybody to the Hearings and Engagement Committee meeting, the 28th of July. Just so some formalities, I'll move the apologies. I have apologies from the Deputy Mayor, Jeff Taylor. I have apologies from Councillor Pascoe, Councillor McPherson, Councillor Nauru Ralph, and lateness from the Mayor. I note Councillor Bunting has to leave at 10:15 for a funeral. But with those apologies, I'll move. Can I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Bunting. Those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Confirmation of the agenda. There are 2 items today. I move the agenda. Can I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor O'Leary. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Confirmation of the Hearings and Engagement Committee open minutes of the 24th of March. I'll move. Can I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Bunting. All those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Right. So the first agenda item is the open air burning bylaw. I understand Sandra will present from staff. Sandra, I'm in your hands.
Thank you. Good morning, councillors. Thank you for having us this morning. I will take the report as read. We went to community consultation on the proposed revocation of the open air burning bylaw, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Thank you. Colleagues, this is an opportunity. We have no submitters, but we have had, of course, a number of written submissions. This would be an opportunity to raise any of those items or concerns. We could add that to our thinking, if you have any questions of the report. Councillor Mark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the report. And there were a couple of submissions that were raised that brought up braziers and the popularity of those. It's still okay to use those, I presume, with this report?
Yes.
Yep.
Braziers, hangi, umu, they're all okay as long as FENZ have not placed a fire restriction on the area, for example, in the middle of a drought.
Yeah. And the proximity to big wooden fences?
Yes. Yeah. As long as there is no risk that by use of those they will cause a fire.
Right. And was there any clarity around the phrase nuisance smoke?
The way, if the revocation of the bylaw went through, Council would still respond to complaints about nuisance smoke to determine whether the FENZ should be involved or whether it was a rubbish fire, for example, in which case it would be dealt with under those aspects or those regulations.
Because I read the bylaw and I was trying to see, if we kept the bylaw, nuisance smoke was still very subjective. Like if my smoke was pouring into my neighbour's yard, it will be a nuisance to them. But by definition, what is that definition? How are we covered?
I'll hand over to Kelvin as to how his team would deal with that. Oh, actually, no, it wouldn't be Kelvin's team anymore, would it?
No, I'd be pleased to say it wouldn't be my team. It would transfer to the waste team, who would inherit that. But look, there is a definition of nuisance. It is a subjective, but if you look across all legislation, the only definition legislatively that exists for nuisance is the one in the Health Act 1956. And it's never been updated since then. So it's always going to be a subjective assessment, but there is a proposed definition that already exists in the bylaw.
Okay. All right, I was just hoping that we're just going to apply common sense around that.
I think that is the overriding thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Mark. Councillor Angela.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I remember when we were putting this together, I think we went and chatted to the fire service And if I recall correctly, they were supportive of this, but there's no formal submission from them. Are they still supportive of these changes?
Fins responded to us that they did not feel that the existing bylaw was relevant anymore because of
Yep.
the Fins Act.
Yep.
And also that earlier proposals to bring in some form of licensing would double up with their existing permitting system. So they did not feel that there was a need for a bylaw that was in their earlier submission,
Yeah.
but they did not put forward an additional submission through the consultation process.
And so then, as far as we know, their views haven't changed. They're still
Correct.
supportive of this move. Yeah.
Correct.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to move when you're ready.
Thank you. Moved by Councillor Angela, seconded by Councillor Martin. I don't see any other, oh, sorry, I do apologise. Councillor Maxine.
Oh, just quickly before you take the vote. The biggest concern from submitters was that concern around nuisance of smoke, etc. What history have we got of complaints on an annual basis?
We receive on average about 200 complaints a year that we attend, and they are all, I guess I'd use the word mediated out, where we go along, our contractors make an assessment whether or not and is there an opportunity. If they can't deal with it at the time, it gets reported back to us and we will do follow-up work with the party or parties involved to try and get a common sense resolution.
And have there been incidences where it's escalated beyond just the simple complaint that are of concern for us as a council that we need to be aware of?
I think if you go back a step, my experience has been that the complaints often are the outcome of a breakdown in a relationship between neighbours, and they also have complaints sometimes about noise, about a range of other activities, and it generally has its genesis in a neighbourly relationship that has broken down. And so, look, we're trying to find common sense solutions to the issues, but every now and then we have a more complicated one, and we have to try and find our way to work through that.
And residents would have opportunity for remedy through a stepped-out process?
Look, the worst case scenario, there are 4 different agencies or bits of legislation that cover this. So it's not, just the nuisance. It depends on the nature of what it is that's being burnt. Is it in breach of some of the other regulations that may exist? There are some other options for consideration.
And our rubbish and recycling team then that's where it's proposed to go to?
That's where it will go,
And
yes.
they would then have the training and opportunity to upskill around that resolution type methodology that you talked about.
Firstly, they've always had the power since the new bylaw came into force, where they will be using the same contractors to do the initial attendance that are used by council, so there's no change there. And they have got some very talented staff who are available to be doing the follow-up, but we'll be having some handover engagement with them.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Look, everybody, I don't see any other questions. I've checked with our Zoom councillors in Mangamari. There's no questions there. The motion on page 12 has been moved by Councillor Angela and seconded by Councillor Martin. Is there any debate? If there is no debate, I'll put the motion. Let's go with with hands. All those in favour, hands up, please. All those against, I think I'll leave it for the staff.
The motion is, I'm blanking, I apologise. The motion is carried unanimously.
No problem. All right, well, thank you for that. We now move to item 6, the Permanent Policy, Public Arts and Memorial Policy. And we do have a number of submitters. The time allocation, some have 10 minutes and some have 5, depending whether they're an organisation or an individual. And the first person I have is Jeremy. Jeremy, a very warm welcome. You're familiar to this chamber. I'm sure you'll feel relaxed. We're in your hands.
Back again. Kia ora koutou, ko Jeremy Mail tōku ingoa. My name is Dr. Jeremy Mail, and I'm here on behalf of Creative Waikato. I know I've been in the chambers a lot recently, and I certainly appreciate your time and consideration around these matters. Public art is an important component of civic and community life. It is good that these policies and processes are being considered, and we have been working alongside the council staff throughout the process. It's particularly important if they're being considered from the perspective of enabling more activity in this space to be supported and considered with proactive engagement from an informed panel. Accessible public art is important for the well-being of our cities. This idea is directly related to a number of elements within your long-term vision for the city, a city where people love to be, a city with lots to do, a city where people thrive. Cities gain value through public art, cultural, social and economic value. Public art can spark conversations, tell stories, provide opportunities to reflect the communities who are present here. It is a vital part of our evolving culture, and it helps us to understand each other as well as adding meaning to our cities, and has the potential to celebrate the uniqueness of our communities whilst also contributing to that uniqueness. Having public art in our spaces, like that which is already being shared with the community of Kirikiriroa through groups like Mesh and Boon, etc., serve to humanise our local environment and invigorate our spaces in creative and inspiring ways. Public art should be a reflection of its place and time. It becomes synonymous with the space that it inhabits. It becomes a marker, a wayfinding guide, a storyteller, a moment in time that connects generations of people together. Public art activates the imagination and encourages people to pay attention and to perceive more deeply the environment they occupy, to think about what is being shared, to find connection to meaning. And as I've said before, most recently, there is no universally loved piece of art, but through enabling these things to happen in an informed way, in a way that encourages activation, there is so much potential to stimulate learning and thought about art and society, about our interconnected lives, about the many cultures who live here, and about the social sphere as a whole. Public art is at its core accessible. It is available for everyone at any time. Sometimes you need to give a little bit of your time and curiosity to discover the hidden wonder that lies within, but that interaction is an exciting one, and one that can connect generations of people. Public art engages social interaction both during the selection process and the following installation. It can have benefit across the well-beings from economic to cultural. It can transform spaces and be a catalyst for regeneration. There will always be different points of view, but these are strengths, not weaknesses, in a field that requires so much collaboration. The policy is outlined here with the Public Art Panel as a supportive guide and the potential task force that could be used to provide additional support and consideration as and when is needed, provide a framework to enable that collaboration, a pathway for meaningful and open discussion that considers options but is also able to support and enable the process, a way for administrators and council to advocate and create opportunities for artists even while negotiating the complexities of institutional processes, regulations and communications around community expectations. This can also be a way for artists to understand the requirements, restrictions and opportunities of any site, alongside the importance of creative scope and openness to aesthetic. Public art at all scales and levels of complexity is fundamentally an interactive and collaborative process involving artists, architects, administrators, design professionals, community residents, civic leaders, elected officials, approval agencies, funding agencies, construction teams, and more. There are complexities in this process, and any implementation of a policy should be looking to support this way in a considered and informed way, looking to support artists' creative involvement through cooperation, not compromise, and to create opportunities for artists to engage in the issues of our time. There's a lot of potential in this work. Extensions of this policy could move into public art and the public art panel as supportive contributors to other civic development, other enhancement of community spaces. Public art is an opportunity to bring artists and their creative vision into the civic decision-making process. In addition to the aesthetic benefits of having works of art in public places, artists can make valuable contributions when they are included in the mix of planners, engineers, designers, elected officials and community stakeholders who are involved in planning public spaces and amenities. Artists bring their own creative skills to those conversations, which can inspire creativity in others, ideally bringing the means of decisions and problem solving to a more responsive and imaginative result. It seems like from the submissions that there is generally a positive attitude towards these policies, and there are clearly passionate people within the city community who've been making proactive communications towards public art in our city spaces over the years, which certainly adds a vibrancy and energy to the city. This is a good thing. The policy and panel should be working to support that, and it seems to be structured in that way. Public art has impact. It is important that we have systems in place to support that. Systems that acknowledge Te Ao Māori, systems that consider the value of local expertise, and a commitment to explore possibilities and consider the potential. This is all part of our learning and growing. Learning happens when we ask questions, when we consider possibilities. Public art prompts exciting and curious questions about our environment and ourselves. It can help us to pay more attention to our spaces. It can explore connections to our history, to our environment, to share stories and create places of meaning within a community. The best of public art should challenge, delight, educate and illuminate. And this is an opportunity to enable more of that for our city. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you very, very much. Colleagues, open up some questions. Councillor Angela.
Jeremy, it's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Just a question, and I'm kind of casting my mind back to the sort of the first iteration of a public art panel that we had, and also when we developed the original public art plan, etc. In terms of the proposed public art panel, I guess two-part question. What do you consider as an art expert? What sort of skills do they need? And is it important that that person also have local and regional knowledge, or is there some merit in having somebody outside the region if they had some, something to add, some expertise that we couldn't fill?
I think having a mix is important, and that's the beauty of having a panel. I think there should be Māori representation on that panel.
Yeah.
I think that there should be local artist representation on that panel. There should be council representation on that panel, and bringing in external advocates when needed is really important, because you want to make sure that the questions around the practicality, the possibilities of that panel, not necessarily about is it good art or bad art. And I think that's the distinction that needs to be made. Yeah. There needs to be a level of trust with the submission, and if there's a level of comfort with the panel across that expertise, then that's the possibility to go forward. It becomes very problematic if we end up debating what is good and bad art.
Yeah, and just on that, Jeremy, in your expert opinion, how will we navigate? Because there's also the proposed task force as well, which I sort of see when things get a bit sticky, then a task force sort of can be formed to manage through that process. How do you think that the panel will be able to avoid not those sticky situations? Because what you're saying is art is subjective, but how do they keep that I suppose their personal views, or their if a piece of public art offends one person on the panel, but do you sort of know what I'm saying? Like, we're in that culture that it's so difficult to know what will offend or what won't.
Definitely.
How do we manage through that?
That is a tricky process, and I think a big part of that will come about through conversation between the group. I think it's about having a really clear, a level of clarity around the proposal, around the story of the artwork, around the space that it plays within the environment. I think if we're looking at public art as being something that reflects the time and place that we live in now, then it's about reflecting a community, and it's about reflecting ideas more than it is reflecting specific
Yeah.
people or places or times. It's about having a layer of interpretation that's available to it, and if that layer of interpretation can be communicated clearly to the panel, and the panel can have a robust discussion about that, that's one thing. But then it's also how that story and how that that understanding is then communicated to the community.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and that storytelling and
that
that
makes sense.
communication is the thing that
Yeah.
often becomes the sticking point, because people
Yeah,
see
you're bang
an
on.
artwork and if you don't give the time to understand it, it seems, oh, what's that thing? And so the
yeah.
communication about what that is, what do
Yeah.
those curves mean, what does that colour mean, what does that pattern mean?
Yeah.
How does that relate to me? How does that relate to the space? How does that relate to the community? Those are all really exciting things. That's a great educational tool for our young people. That's a great way that we establish space. That's the key. And it is tricky, but that's important.
I think that's the best answer I've had to a very difficult question, so thank you.
A pleasure.
Thanks, Councillor Angela. Now,
get that.
we've run out of time, but I see Manga Tapora has a quick question. So, Tapora, good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And very quick, and it's probably just an extension of what Councillor O'Leary was asking around the experts on the task force. How do we verify the expertise? Do we verify that by, in your opinion, Jeremy, do you verify that by mandate or qualification or experience?
Is this for the task force or the panel, or both?
The task force in the first instance.
I see the task force as being a thing that is kind of the end of a sticky process, and I think that will need to be formed based on the context of why it's being formed. And so if it's being formed for cultural reasons, then I think having clear representation of the different parties that are affected by that is going to be important. Having an ability to mediate that as well within the group as well as externally will be important. And then it's a very hard question to answer, because it will depend on the artwork and the context and the thing. And I think if we have got the policy right and the panel right, then the need for the task force should be less and less, because the front end of the process will have considered all of those things.
Asking around how we verify the experts is, because you're absolutely right. We'll bring in the task force when it gets to end of very long string. But it was just your opinion on how we would verify that we have absolutely right people, expert people on there, and how we might go about that. But that's very difficult.
Yeah, I think engaging with community experts, engaging with your panel about picking that task force to support their work, and engaging with organisations in the community who have the expertise to support you, and just see what it needs to be on a case-by-case basis.
Jeremy, thank you very much. We've run out of time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
The next submitter is Dr. Joe Citizen. Could I remind everybody who are presenting, ideally, to leave some time for questions. So, Joe, a very warm welcome. 5 minutes. And if you could just leave a couple of minutes for questions to enable my colleagues to ask any questions they may have. A very warm welcome.
Tēnā koutou, some new faces, some old faces, good to see you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to my online submission. I do in general support the formation of a public art panel, but I have some reservations regarding its constitution. I support iwi and hapu representation, but think that the panel should consist of practicing artists who have had experience in making public art works rather than council representatives and arts administrators. Artists who aspire to making public art should be talking to those who have had actual lived experience. There's a tuakana taina aspect to having a mentorship conversation like this, not the least of which because the emphasis is on how can this be done, rather than the important but not overriding concerns concerning risk mitigation. In relation to the proposal to establish a task force to determine if a work of art can be considered offensive or not, I can only support the decision to distinguish between public artworks and public monuments in the first instance. Monuments and memorial artworks have historically tended to be in the forms of pillars, plinths and the like, or as realistic representations of people, things or animals. It is important, however, to recognise that these traditions are informed by very specific cultural frameworks. Being informed by Te Tiriti o Waitangi means acknowledging that monuments and memorial artworks do not and should not only be informed by any one single cultural tradition. Similarly, permanent public artworks are never going to have universal appeal, not the least of which because what can be considered art or toi Māori come from different cultural frameworks. What is at the heart of this is an understanding of placemaking and the need for different social and cultural identities to be articulated through both monuments and public artworks. Navigating the ethics of cultural representation forms is the work of arts and culture specialists, and their inclusion on the public art panel would help mitigate some of these risks. The phrase significant upset needs ongoing guidance, as every situation will be different. Arguably, the role of public art may include challenging traditional perspectives or helping to provide a touchstone for those whose values are not otherwise evident. Artworks that attempt to have universal appeal are at best banal because they have no meaning to anyone. Similarly, the term artistic merit needs more clarification. Different cultural traditions have different understandings of what is or is not considered to be of merit. Contemporary art typically is not understood to be traditional. You may notice that I use the term artworks rather than just the term art. The inclusion of work into the definition is important, and not just because of the significant amount of work that is often unrecognised in making permanent works. It helps to identify that permanent public art is not limited to static objects such as sculptures or carvings. The policy should therefore include statements that identify the validity of contemporary artworks that have audio, visual, lighting or digital components and/or installation practice. I'd also like to see more guidance around what is or not included in an artist's brief and who is responsible for providing one. My own experience in this matter was haphazard and borrowed from Wellington City Council's template, which was good in a way as it provided a risk management framework, but not so good as it was not specific to Hamilton. It would be more practical to have a clear indication of the processes involved at the outset, and this should include how council decision-making and council policies and responsibilities interrelate. What is really needed is a permanent public artwork production manager, whose role it is to coordinate between the different council departments and external stakeholders and contractors. Artists are not naturally drawn to risk mitigation, and their time and skills should not be focused on the making. Their time and skills should be focused on the making of art, and not the nitty-gritty of civic planning and resource management. This leads me to the thorny question of maintenance. I don't believe that public artwork should be solely managed by the museum's collection staff, as their expertise is typically for the care of historically important objects and fine art practices. Not having the requisite expertise in audio-visual components or electrical and IT infrastructure means that many contemporary artworks may not ever get past the proposal stage because concerns about maintenance cannot be accommodated. Maintenance concerns should really be handled by a dedicated production manager who could draw upon the expertise of the museum when required. There's much more I could add here, but I've run out of time.
Thanks, Doctor. I see we've got one question from Councillor Mark.
I was actually being respectful of your time and I couldn't turn it off, so I'll hold my question. Thank you.
All right,
Thanks,
no
John.
problem.
Thanks, cheers.
Do I have any other questions, colleagues? Councillor Martin? And
Dr.
then-
Simpson, respect your submission and thank you. Just generally, you know, creating the atmosphere, you know, because we have groups such as Toti and Mesh and others who are philanthropic, who are, you know, providing the funding base. Do you have any comments of whether this policy, as you see it, encourages groups to come forward? You know, because there's the money, then obviously there's the link with the artist and the artistic endeavour.
One of my primary concerns is that if I was a young person attempting to go through this process, it's not at all transparent.
Right.
It's really, I mean, in many ways, this process was, for me, immensely complicated. And there's multiple instances when it could have been derailed. And so that's really why I've referred directly to this thing about museum staff having competency. They do have competency, but within their field, and that should be recognised, that it doesn't necessarily include all aspects of public artworks. The other thing is having something like the public art panel, just having clear sort of processes identified. They don't exist. So I mean, these things are not straightforward, and attempting to streamline these things so that understanding how council policies and how council decision making sort of all align, and there is actually a process to be followed. Yeah, it's not straightforward at all. And if I was a young person today trying to come up with an idea, I really do not see a way forward for them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Mayor Paula?
Yeah, that answers one of my questions actually, but the other question was around the ethics. I think I heard you that you're suggesting, were you suggesting that the panel include the appropriate skill set to determine or to put it to make sure the process is adequately adhered to in respect to ethics of the various artworks? Is
Yes,
that what you're
correct.
saying?
Yep.
So you're saying that's a unique skill set as well?
Yes, so that's typically, I mean, in a museum setting, or an art gallery setting, that's the role of a curator.
Curator.
Yeah.
Yeah, so something similar where someone has that. And then, of course, Te Pora asked a question with the last speaker, I suppose, around that element of cultural arts, tangata whenua in particular. You'd see the need perhaps for that person to always also have a deep roots in Māori taonga, te ao Māori, and all of those, the tikanga and all of that thing that might apply to an artwork.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking to the very heart of trickiness, if you like, between contemporary art and toi Māori in the first instance anyway. You may want to have two people. I mean, it's not a straightforward proposition. It's at the heart of... It's actually the reason why many of our world-leading contemporary artists straddle both worlds. Yeah.
To you, Mr. Chair, it'd be lovely to talk about that later. The ethical side of things is of interest to me. Thanks very much, by the way, for your work on the waka.
Thank you.
And we, really appreciate you sticking with it and getting it done. So thank you so much.
That was a partnership process. Thanks.
Thank you.
Dr. Joe, I've got one more question, although we've gone way over time. Councillor Sarah has a quick question, I'm sure, for you.
Okay, thank you, Chair, for your generosity there. Joe, I was just really interested in your comments around the process not being transparent and clear, and you did make one suggestion in regards to the maintenance side of things. Did you have, just interested in any other suggestions that you had beyond what's in your written submission?
Yeah, I mean, what's really needed here is a different approach to infrastructure. So we've tended towards objects, but things that are of a digital nature or require electrical connection often run up against developmental processes, and that's precisely why not only do I promote the idea of a production manager, but also that you need to have some approach to understanding an IT infrastructure and better access to electrical, connection, particularly along the river and in public spaces.
Okay, so it's enabling more forms of art in using different media.
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Cool.
Thanks for your submission.
Thank you.
Doctor, thank you for your time. A very warm welcome to Nancy. Nancy, you're very familiar with the chamber. Welcome. Again,
To keep pulling my chair out every time I need to sit down. Thank you, Lance.
the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. If you could leave a couple of minutes within that 10-minute time frame for questions, that would be very much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning to a very sparse chamber. Not used to speaking to so few people. I like a lot of audience when I speak, but never mind. You're all familiar with who I am. I'd like to introduce my colleague here, Karen O'Megan, because Karen is going to be the next chair of Mage Sculpture Hamilton. After 13 years, I deserve a retirement from the chair position. So we're here to support the proposal that Council have put forward. The first proposal being about the separation of the art, the monument part to public artwork. And we believe that that is a move in the right direction, and we totally support that. We're not experts in the field of monuments, so we're not here to talk about the task force aspect of it. But we just want to put into on record that there's more than one way in which one can make commemoration. Bronze is a traditional way of the 19th century. We should not be too hung up on bronzes. There are other ways and other modern ways of representation, and we hope that Council will encompass discussion of how these other ways could be done. Our concern here today, obviously, is the talk about the implementation of the public art panel. We have been around for over 13 years. There's only been 4 councillors in this chamber who have seen us through all this time. Martin, I salute your longevity. Even you've been in, out, in, and Angela, you've been around. And Rob and Dave. The rest of you are fairly new, so you may not be aware that we have had a public art process that included a public art panel. Then we didn't have a public art panel. We have a public art panel. We didn't have a... So it's like playing hokey-cokey here. So we're in again here. We could selfishly say don't have a panel because for Mage, it actually makes the process longer and a bit more bureaucratic, but we like to see things from the greater good of the community, and we think that from that aspect there is a need for a panel. We have the expertise, but not everyone. As you hear from Joe, it can be quite a daunting process for some artists who may want to bring art to the city, and so to have a panel that can provide that kind of peer review and help would be very beneficial. So from the greater good of the city, Mage would be supportive of putting in a panel. As those of you know, we ourselves have a very rigorous curatorial process in the way in which we select our artists and our artwork. We have curators that draw up our artist brief. They go through a selection process. They select the concept which best suit the work, and then at each of this process, the curators take their recommendation to the Mage board, and then, only then, when it passes through our own rigorous process, does it come to council. So hence my earlier comment about making sure that the process is not a hindrance, but an enhancement of that. Way back when, we did have a process where each step that goes to council had 3 steps. So a 3-step public art process became a 9-part public art process. And believe me, I lost my hair when this color because of that process. So I'm hoping that the process itself will be clear and it will work well for all of us who want to bring art to the city. So crucial for us is how will council select the members of the panel. We want to see assurances of the caliber of the panel, who will be peer reviewing the selection of our curatorial team. We want to be clear that the appointed members of the panel have a clear understanding of their role, and that is assessing the appropriateness of the proposed artwork relative to the site or the public consideration, and not to make personal judgment on the actual artworks themselves. We think that the panel should consist of people involved with modern art education, artists, has already been mentioned, curators, people with museum gallery backgrounds, people like architects, landscape designers, mana whenua. Much as we love our council staff, we do not want to see them on the panel. They can be there to facilitate, but we just believe that it would be a more a free-flowing process without that, yes. There is already a precedence in council for that. If we look at the urban design review panel, there's no councillors or council staff on that. So I think the council staff has always been there to facilitate the meeting, to ensure that the panel members have the support. So I could say a lot more, but I want to have lots of debate on questions and discussions with you guys. So I'm giving you as much time as, I don't know how much time we've got left, but however much time we have.
Thank you, Nancy. The good news, since you prefer a large audience, there's actually quite a few councillors online. So you've got Councillor Ryan, Manga Tapora, Councillor Cash, and Councillor Sarah. So please just don't assume it's what you see in the chamber.
Hi there, Zoom land councillors.
See if I can find any buyers for some questions for you.
Please do.
Any questions, Colin? Mayor Paula.
Use your expertise and experience and revisit the aspect of ethics in art. Have you got a comment on how that is best managed, or have you given any thinking to that? You've obviously, as you know, you've been around for a fair long time, so you've seen examples of this play out one way or another over time.
So when you talk about ethics, are we referring here to the monument aspect?
I suppose, but as you say, monuments aren't just the brass statues. The statues are just one form of monument, but anything that has that monumental reverence kind of reflection around it, have you got any advice on us as to how we handle determining the ethics around a piece of art?
Okay.
Notwithstanding judging the actual aesthetics,
sure.
The ethical side.
Sure. I think one of I can't speak for other people who might want to bring art to Hamilton. For Mish, we always like to do artwork that tells a story. So we go through, before we even write the artist's brief, we do a lot of investigation around the site in question, and we try to find out what was there before. We try to find out historical perspective, whether there are any past sites there, and what constraints would be there, so that when the artist is given a brief, they have all this information in hand. Bearing in mind that we are not constrained just by using local artists, we try to do what is best for the city. So we look at works which will give the city credibility internationally. So we look for the best artists for the site, and some artists may not be familiar with Hamilton, and therefore the more information we give them, the easier it is for them to translate that into their work, and then perhaps handle that ethical question in their design, in their concept design.
Thank you.
Councillor Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Kia ora, Nancy. I just had a question in terms of the composition of the panel. A previous presenter talked about needing artists on the panel, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts around what kind of proportion the panel should be in terms of, say, artists themselves, and then are there other experts, or they mentioned art administrators,
Yeah, okay. So I think you don't want a whole panel of artists, because artists critiquing other artists' work can also give rise to issues. I think you want a panel which is not too large. Probably the last few panels that we've worked with have always been about 5 people, and that seems to be a good workable number. Of the 5, you can then have somebody representing art, perhaps somebody representing education, somebody in the business community that has a relationship to sites, like an architect or landscape architect, a designer, that sort of person. Somebody with curatorial or museum work that will then answer the question that Joe brought up about maintenance of the artwork. So you then have a mixture of people that can feed off each other and bring their mixed expertise towards critiquing or rather reviewing the artwork.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Thank you. We've run out of time. Always nice to see you, Nancy.
You can always go over time. I have no problem. No pressure on my part.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I welcome Mark Servian from the Riff Raff Public Arts Trust. Mark, you two are very familiar in this environment. A warm welcome.
Cheers.
You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Kia ora, folks. I have a sense of deja vu because 20 years ago we were getting ready. I was working on the Riff Raff statue, and the very first public art policy was being drawn up, and I was negotiating with the council staff at the time the two things were going on at once. Basically, we were commissioning Riff Raff, and the policy was being written, and we were talking to each other so that the policy would work for the statue. So I've given a lot of thought to how to come up with a policy that would allow Riff Raff but not allow Captain Hamilton, to be blunt, because clearly this gets to the crux of what constitutes offensive and so forth. So most of what I'm actually going to say, my notes actually cover new points that I didn't make in my written submission. I'll just very quickly address it. I think most of what I've said in my written submission has been said already, and that is that we need more detail in the policy about who is going to be on the panel. We need more diversity in the sorts of art specialist is just too broad. My submission makes points about the way that we want to have a diversity of people in there. Now, the issue that Nancy pointed to, which is size, is obviously a question. I feel that a combination of representation of different types of traditions and even a range of council staff would be useful, but obviously if it gets too big. So maybe we're talking about a cloud of supporters, of advisors around the actual panel making the decisions. I also made a point in my written submission that Joe's echoed, which is how does someone who's not Nash, who isn't Totty, gets to actually get up a proposal. I will apologise to Joe because I did identify him as cis male, which is not how he identifies, and didn't acknowledge the fact that he had good mana whenua involvement in his project. However, I believe we both agree that the point I was ham-fistedly making stands, which is how does somebody just walk in off the street with an idea and get it built, which is what I did. I was just an ordinary citizen on the DPB, and I thought we needed a statue of Riff Raff. That's all I did. I mean, I wasn't one of the great or the good of the town. So that's my comments on my written submission. The points I want to make, I think that the question about offensiveness comes down to establishing a threshold between offensive and harmful, because not all controversies are equal. So how do you tell if it's harmful? I would suggest that it's the question of the relative power and privilege embedded in the piece, which is to say, does it punch up or does it punch down? That's essentially the question you have to ask yourself. So you establish a threshold, because clearly Captain Hamilton was tangibly harmful to tangata whenua, to mana whenua. To use the word offence doesn't really cover it. To equate the feeling that mana whenua have of the tangible threat that Captain Hamilton represented versus moral conservatives who didn't like Riff Raff is not a good match. So actually I think while I recognise that it's natural to look at the process and how did we get to that situation with Captain Hamilton, Really what needs to happen is the council needs to sort of not just have a public art policy and monument policy. In the area of monuments, it needs a monuments agenda, which is to say that the council itself should be involved in an ongoing public engagement on the question of what stories the city wants to tell about itself and how it wants to tell them through its monuments and public art. Otherwise, you surrender all of the storytelling function to those of us who've got the wealth or the guile to get our ideas up. Now, this vacuum is one that I exploited. There was no agenda, and I'm not suggesting that an agenda takes in everything or everything has to fit the agenda. But the point is that the purpose of Captain Hamilton was to commemorate the foundation of Hamilton. That's a reasonable thing to want to do. Origin tales are an important part of placemaking. They're really important. The trouble is, in the case of Hamilton, Kirikiriroa was here first. So there's contested foundations. I mean, look, Captain Hamilton was possibly the least triumphantly posed, most apologetic military image ever created. He managed to not really celebrate the man or the town, and yet still be problematic. I mean, I wasn't as upset as the people who wanted to pull him down, but I always thought it was problematic. But we do actually want to tell origin tales, to have, and all cultures want to understand and celebrate the start of their settlements. So what we need is it's contested. Our origin tales are contested. So I think that it's a contingent upon the council. I think you have a duty. I think you have an opportunity to actually, as Hamilton City Council, Te Kanahere o Kirikiriroa, to manifest the treaty partnership by getting on with the job of trying to tell the stories in this town. And that's an agenda, that's not a policy. And your role in that is just to set, I'm not suggesting that as councillors you decide what the artwork should be or how the story should be told, but in 10 years' time, are you going to want to put a memorial up about COVID? That's a decision for this council. It's Captain Hamilton was put there because someone in the private sector thought they should. It should have been the council that decided that we want to commemorate the circumstances of the foundation of this town, and then give it over to a public art panel or whatever mechanism you want to actually work out the parameters for that, and then for the artist to actually work on the brief. So I actually do want to tautoko Joe's idea about a coordinating role, because I think there's strategy and agenda here, not just process, that needs to be addressed, and that's going to be a lot of work for that public art panel overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Colleagues, any questions? Yes, Mayor Paula.
Thank you, Mark. Found it very interesting and thought-provoking what you had to say. One of the concepts that shared with me by the ex-mayor of New Orleans, which resonated with me in this whole consideration, was the difference between reverence, revering something, and remembering something, and how they might be treated ethically. And I wondered if you had a comment on that.
Well, reverence, I guess, may be a synonym for celebrate, potentially. And that's when we have, look, statue arguments. The whole world is engaged in statue arguments. And the counter-argument against pulling down a statue is that you're somehow erasing history. But the fact of the matter is that a statue has been put there with an agenda. You didn't just put it there. It's not devoid of meaning. It was put there to assert, to celebrate, to put forward a particular narrative. So if you're going to do that, what that narrative should be is obviously something that the whole community needs to have a part in. Or not. I mean, look, I'm aware of the fact that Riff Raff, I had an agenda. I'm not that much of a Rocky Horror fan. I mean, my reasoning for doing Riff Raff was I really wanted to sort of bring Hamilton up as a cosmopolitan centre, to kick it in the ankles as a cow town, because the alternative was blowing up the cow at the other end of the main street. I mean, that was the effect I was looking for. So I come from a place of wanting to challenge those norms, but I think it's the norms have to sit somewhere. Somebody has to set them, and I'd rather you were doing it as the democratic representatives of the city than someone who simply had the opportunity and the wealth to actually just assert their version of it. So I think
to flesh that one out a bit, because it leads really nicely into my next question.
Yeah.
So you're suggesting that council should decide, and I'm just wondering what council consists of, because council's a point of time. And as Angela will know very well, better than anybody else in this room, things have changed across those election cycles that you've been involved in. And Nancy, you said the same thing, right? So it's just who's elected at the time. So how do we get bigger than that? Where are the principles sitting? Also, of course, at the moment, council doesn't have a strong representation from iwi. That's changing. And obviously, that's an important part of the placemaking origin tales that you're talking about. Have you got a comment on that?
Yes. I mean, that kind of points to what I was saying before. I'm not suggesting that it's up to the politicians or the council, the council in this room or the council in the building to say how something should be done. But you can set the agenda as to what is marked. And I would suggest, for instance, that the origins of the city is an obvious one, the day of settlement. Now, we have war memorials. Somebody decided to put a war memorial in. And so what the process is how do we mark moments in history? That's what I'm talking about. And if someone comes, it's around deciding as a community, what are the things collectively that are important enough to mark? And that's not necessarily a very long list. It might, at this point, only be how do we mark the origins of this town, but the origin tale of this town. I mean, that might be all it is. But just ask yourselves the question, because the policy only deals with process.
Just one final bit on that, just to wrap that bit up, is so you would support that before the council reaches that decision or those principles that engages in a community conversation across iwi, wider community.
Absolutely. And in terms of the origin, I mean, that's absolutely a partnership exercise for the very reasons I outlined, because you'd be commemorating not just the formation of Hamilton, but the formation of Kirikiriroa before it. And there will be other things in history that will be the same that are part of the partnership process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Look, thank you very much. We've definitely run out of time. But
thanks.
I'm so sorry, Martin. We are coming under some pressure with time because we've got another meeting that follows this one. Carolyn, a very warm welcome. Kia ora. Carolyn, we've got 5 minutes. If you could try to leave a minute or so for some questions, but otherwise the floor is yours.
It won't take 5 minutes. I'm pretty sure that my submission was about 3 sentences, to be quite honest. Kia ora tātou, i te whare, kia koe te marae kura o te kaunihera pola, me koe hoki te tiamana. Ko Carolyn Hopa tōku ingoa, no Ngāti Wairere. So I think that I might have been on the list of, gee, let's think what mana whenua think, right? So I got the email fairly late in the piece. And my submission was only about 3 sentences long, because I think that, one, that mana whenua need to ensure that they participate in whatever the decision-making is. We can't constantly be sitting outside of council and being critical if we're not going to participate in some of the decision-making. So, hence the 3 sentences. But definitely one of the things that I did pick up, and I'm not an artist, so I definitely take my portrait off to all the people behind me who have that expertise and knowledge. But I do have a background as a policy maker, and I think that one of the things that's really important about developing policy is exactly what the gentleman before us said. It's about getting out there and getting the thoughts so that we can determine what the standards look like in relation to what it is that we want to achieve as a community in terms of the art pieces that are placed in the city. Don't go to Morrinsville, there's lots of cows, there's about 38. Just wanted to say because I'm from there. And I think that, so we're looking for what the best outcomes are and the stories and the narratives that can be told through the art pieces. We're also wanting to ensure that what's reflected in those art pieces tell a story about the cultural well-being for us as a people living within Kirikiriroa. So, and that's why I said that I thought that we needed to, let's have the really good conversation about what those standards might look like. Certainly, I also mentioned in my response that I don't necessarily advocate the view of the entire of Ngāti Wairere, but I certainly would be going back to both Tauhei and Hukanui Marae and saying to my whānau, I think my recommendation is that we support that these policies are developed and we get in behind it and we become a positive part of helping to develop those policies. And I bet you I'm in my time.
Well, please don't disappear because we've got some, no doubt we might have some questions. Thank you for the brevity and the clarity of your submission. Colleagues, either online or here, in the chamber? Mayor Southgate. Thanks, my good deputy, thank you very much. No, I can see that. Mayor Paula.
Thank you. Just a quick one following on from the thread that I've been taking, and I heard you say about stories about cultural wellbeing, following on from Mark's comments around stories about our origin and whatever we define stories should be like. Just flesh out for me, if you could, how the cultural ethics of the considerations could be managed, or are you saying that we have that big broad conversation about what did you say, about the standards we apply to these things across all parts of the community, tangata whenua, community at large, artistic community and others, and then that informs how we, the lens through which the
what policy might look like. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, whether or not, what the process looks like that follows on from that, that policy. So, and I've never participated in any of the decisions around the art that's placed within Kirikiriroa. I sat on the periphery of the warhorse, and I don't know how many people actually know the background story to that particular monument. Initially, I thought it was really ridiculous, and then when I heard the background to it, I realised actually that's quite a significant story to be told. And how many of us in Kirikiriroa know that story. So I think that there's also other ways of being able to get the narratives out there. But I guess in the first instance, I just wanted to say Ngāti Wairere are here, and I would certainly be advocating that we participate in a really progressive and supportive way.
We appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
There are no further questions either on the board or on Zoom. What's happened?
Oh no, just no questions.
Okay, thank you. Glenda from Waikato Tainui, a very warm welcome.
Kia ora.
You have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Ka pai. Kei ngā kai kaunihira o Kirikiriroa, tēnā rā koutou katoa. I just want to acknowledge mana whenua who have spoken today, Ngāti Wairere from Carolyn, and also Te Hao Te Whenua o Kirikiriroa. For Waikato Tainui public arts, monuments and memorials, they can't really be disconnected from each other. They are the way that we tell our story and allow the world to understand what our culture and our heritage is. It's also a way that Kirikiriroa as a city and as a people can tell the world what's important to us. Most of our comments are around and have already been spoken about in regards to having a strategy around cultural footprint and how that impacts the identity of Kirikiriroa and the story that it tells the world. Artworks are merely an output for culture, so it makes sense for there to be a strategy and an agenda to help inform any such policy that's created. As part of the policy, we welcome an inventory of current public art and monuments and memorials. This would allow a review to ensure these pieces align to the city's aspirations around identity and to be able to preempt any further monuments or memorials that may be seen as culturally traumatic or forms of cultural misappropriation. And I take the note said previously from me around tangible threats. I think that's really relevant. We support the idea of a task force to first set a strategy and an agenda, and would encourage expertise from hapu and mana whenua groups, Te Hao Te Whenua Kirikiriroa as an example. Ngāti Wairere and Waikato Tainui would obviously support those groups in their voice. We'd encourage that this begin at an aspirational space to help inform a policy, and it's not isolated to art, and includes equity of access to being able to tell a story, and those comments have also been supported from previous submitters. We do want to ask, what is the policy's alignment to works on street names
as the two kaupapa for us are interconnected and they tell the story of what is important to Kirikiriroa. And finally, building developments happening within the city that we are a part of are also enhancing the city's artworks and installations. We'd like to understand how this policy can acknowledge or support developments that are taking a vested interest in ensuring builds have strong cultural footprint and are aligned to the city's potential aspirations around art pieces. And they are providing a funding base for a lot of art practitioners. And they are supporting the city's identity through artworks. So it's not just philanthropic funders that are creating this space for our practitioners. That's it from us. If there's any questions.
Thank you very much. Open the floor to questions. Mayor Paula, followed by Councillor Angela.
Thank you. Since you answered the question I've been asking previous speakers, I won't ask that one. But what I am interested in terms of the strategy, is your view on how this would fit with He Pō Manawa Ora, which of course we have. There's a lot of historical restoration, storytelling woven through that. So have you got a view on that? Do we need to use He Pō Manawa to inform this and dive deeper into the detail?
I think that's the opportunity available, that the artworks or art installations have an opportunity to be the output for those types of strategies, and just having that alignment, I think, is really important.
Okay, but we still need a broader strategy around.
I think so, and I do want to support the previous comment around an agenda and how that aligns with the importance of the story of Kirikiriroa and its mana whenua, and how that can support art pieces that align to the agenda, the prioritisation as well of what stories need to be told before others possibly, and I'm sure delving on those strategies that are already available, how art pieces and installations can be the outputs for those stories.
So that's interesting. So a new thought that you've just raised there with me is around the priority of storytelling, which, and as Mark said, determine what you want to talk about without. My concern is we still allow for community driven art at the same time as defining the stories. So you never know what good ideas are percolating in the grassroots community and elsewhere. So.
I suppose that's possibly the difference between what publicly funded or publicly supported artworks are, and you will always have, I suppose, privately supported fundings and artworks and installations, and iwi may be a part of that, mana whenua may be a part of that, and you've got a lot of corporates and Crown agencies in the city now that are creating those as we speak. So I'm sure if they understood the agenda or the prioritisation of the city, they may be able to support that as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Glenda, I have a question from Councillor Angela for you.
I just want to clarify with you, and I'm still hearing Jeremy's words and his explanation to me about a question I asked. You said at the start that monuments and public art for Māori aren't separated. And actually, when I think about that, Māori art, or whatever the appropriate term for it is exceptional at telling the story. You don't do any piece without it being such. And actually, probably a lot of cultures are like that. European culture isn't like that. So are you saying that for Māori, there shouldn't be or you couldn't work within this process because you don't have that separation of monumental public art, or that it shouldn't be considered at all in this process? I'm just trying to get from what's going to work for you.
I think we will always work in whatever process is provided. We've done that for a very long time, but I think the importance of us is art, any output has a holistic view. Any art installation has probably, in its way, has reverence from a historical narrative in it. So I suppose art for us can be a memorial, can be a monument. It is all intertwined and interconnected. And I suppose if the task force would hopefully go out to gain more understanding of what is required of the policy, our people would probably, it would be difficult to differentiate between those. If I think of a tukutuku panel or a whakairo piece, that can be any of those 3 or 4 or 5 things, an art piece, a monument, a memorial, they're all intertwined into the one output.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's really helpful.
Thanks, Glenda. Thank you very much.
Ngā mihi.
Right, our final presenter, Raweri, a very warm welcome, a very familiar face. We've allocated 10 minutes. If you could leave just a couple of minutes for questions.
I think I'll only take a couple of minutes to read it out and then leave you with eight minutes for questions. But I think you've already got the answers anyhow, from what I'm hearing. But thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for providing the opportunity to make a comment on this arts policy. I think you've already read it. And I suppose to elaborate upon the points which I'm trying to get to is that we don't see that it's a good way to go to have us input into a panel or otherwise to be decided by somebody else. Probably what I'm trying to say is that over the years there's been a tendency to if you want to talk, you want to talk to the top man, right? And then if we want to talk, we end up talking to the bottom man. And somehow or another, there's a whole lot of filters in between. So I think what we're saying here is that in terms of art for art's sake, art for Māori's sake, art for anybody's sake, is about them having the opportunity to bring their art forward in whatever shape or form or whatever's acceptable. So we're thinking that a panel is probably not a way to go in order to how would I'll tell you, capture us. It's probably be better to have us on the outside providing comment too, in order that we can then maintain our accountability and all the rest of it too, because a lot of our art is responsible and accountable art to some period of time or history or kōrero. And so we can't just go around blasting it out left, right and centre because somebody in the higher levels have decided to do so. So what I'm thinking is, or we're thinking is that unfortunately we wouldn't like to be part of that panel. We would rather be beside it, so we can provide our input to who was making the decision. And it doesn't say in here who is, but I presume it's the council laws. If it is, then we'd like to be able to make our comments known directly to the decision makers. Yeah, and therefore for them to make the decision in order that we can then get equity, accountability, responsibility for the decision. Now, whether that just includes Māori art or public art or anybody else's art, really up to the council. But in terms of Māori art, we believe Mana Te Ao Te Whenua thinks that rather than be included in something where we could be captured or taken over or whatever by the majority vote, to have 2 panels, if you want a word, or 2 independent panels to provide the appropriate information, the appropriate comments to the decision maker. And I presume that's you guys at some time. There's been too many times where we've put ideas and everything forward, not just us, everybody. People throwing stones and all the rest of it because they can't get to the decision maker. No. And this provides an opportunity to do that. And maybe it would minimise, alleviate a lot of that anxiety which people have got around different types of art, different types of perceptions. You look around most of the artwork and all that around Hamilton at the moment. We did that through the private enterprise. So private enterprise can do what they like, not necessarily right, but they come up with the funds so we can do it. If the public could come to the game and then we could expand that theme into bigger themes than just the private man. I think there would be a better opportunity too. And that could be done through this independent, separate panel where we could have a go at or provide input into the council decision makers themselves. And that's really, other than what type of art, how many of it, and all the rest of it, which we can all work through. It all comes back to the theme, the vision, and the buck. If we've got the theme, we've got the vision. You guys got the vision. You guys got to get some vision for the city at some time. Then it's a matter of just coming through with what we agree upon, and the buck. So I don't want to take it any more further than that. I think that's quite self-explanatory. I thought.
All right.
I could be wrong.
Thank you very much.
And raise the question, open for questions. Yeah.
Right. I don't currently have any questions.
That was easy.
That's always a good sign that we've understood what you've said. So thank you.
Oh, I can go. What do I come here for then? Gee, you could have said.
No.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, colleagues. So we have a staff recommendation on page 18. And that is that we received the report and obviously this will now go back as part of the community engagement process on the 17th of June and the 9th of July. Do I have anybody wanting to move the staff?
So Chair, there's no recommendation. There's actually no staff report.
No, that, in their defence, there was a technical issue. If you were to now resync, the report will come up. And sorry, that it is page 18. Sometimes things on Diligent disappears and then comes back. And so it had been there, it disappeared. And so I had the same panic, Councillor Angela, a wee while ago.
Oh, still
and
no.
then when I resynced it, it came back again.
Okay. To bear with. 'Cause
All right, and so we've got an amendment from Mayor Paula.
Okay, hang on, just around the timing. I think the recommendation, can we have it up or I can't see it, please?
We'll get that up, and then have you been able to put your amendment to staff yet in terms of words?
No,
Okay.
I haven't, sorry.
You're going to do questions after you've got
I
a
am.
motion?
Yep, I just
Or,
thought I...
or feedback for what I'd like to see in the report? Yep.
Correct,
Cool.
yep.
Okay.
So far, nobody's moved the staff's recommendation, and I've got an indication... Okay, moved...
The original thing to the Environment Committee, was that just a typo that's going to Community Committee?
So I understand the open air bylaw goes back to the Environment Committee.
Sorry,
Yep.
got it. Apologies.
No problem, that was item 5. Item 6, I think it goes back to community.
Yeah,
Right.
the tenure of my amendment, and just hear me out, councillors, you can see with your interest in this, is that just with all of the really good wealth of feedback that we've had today, I think it needs to go back through have this reported to a workshop and have a little bit more time. There's a lot in here for staff to work through. 31st of August is not that far away. I wonder, to do it right, and do it properly, it might be better. So you were thinking of a different timeline?
Yeah. Through you, Mr. Chair, if I could just make a comment on that. I've just been talking to Joe, and just some of the matters that have been brought up today. It's a pretty tight time frame, and we want to make sure we get this right. And I think it was brought up during the discussion about making sure this links with He Pomanawa Ora and some of the other pieces of work we're doing. So my recommendation would be to bring it back. I think the next meeting after that's the 12th of October, which gives us a bit more time to actually have some meaningful discussion, because I think there's some very relevant matters brought up today that's going to take a bit more work than what we originally thought. to make sure that you have all the information for good decision making.
Understood. Thanks, Lance. Mayor Paula, would you be comfortable if, in fact, we use the staff's recommendation as the basis of what will then become your motion, and we simply change the date to reflect your aspirations?
Yeah. And just noting in the minutes that prior to that, we will have the opportunity to workshop this further.
Yeah.
That would do
So
it, wouldn't it?
really, it's just the C, and we're now saying October,
I'm happy for you to move it,
12th.
Angela. I'll come in and second you. So,
of which case we have Councillor Angela moving, Your Worship, Mayor Paula, seconder. Everybody now has seen that. Everybody on Zoom. Councillor Sarah, you've seen the small change. Wonderful. So it's been moved, it's been seconded. I now open it for debate. Oh, sorry, some questions.
We'd like to then have, just to make sure, considered at the briefing then. Yeah.
All right.
So mine is just, and I'm sure that staff have picked up a lot of this, but just to be really clear on how the process will be, how the task force and the panel will be formed, how it will be run, how it will be accountable, etc. Because a lot of the submitters did talk about process today, so I'm sure you've got that on your list. Also, I'd like to make sure that I have an understanding of how we'll work with submitters to make sure that they're comfortable with the process that we form as well. I mean, there was a lot of expertise there today, and a lot of them have actually been through former processes, and of course we got some criticism about the current process or previous processes. So I really want to understand not just that we've devised a process and gone here, I hope you're going to be happy with it, but that we're really involving them, because they're the ones that are going to be jumping through the hoops that we want them to jump through. Also, there seemed to be quite a division around whether EMs and council staff will be involved in the panel, so some whether they should and whether they shouldn't. There were some strong views either way, so I'd like to understand what options you're going to put up for that, and then the rationale behind it. Lance, I know that you've been so involved with this in other areas as well. How we, Mark Servian's submission, I think it was his submission, he talked about not just differentiating between monuments and public art, but actually having a bit of a plan for the monuments as well. And he said, I thought it was quite a good example when he said, you know, what if in a couple of years someone wants to remember COVID? So whether the staff are going to be not just separating those out, but actually having a plan for what monuments a city might want to see or something in the future. And I think the Mayor asked a couple of questions around that. Bear with me, I'm nearly finished. Also, how the policy with this panel and task force will ensure that we get the right outcomes rather than just talk about the process. I think a couple of submitters raised that as well. Glenda's submission really interested me when she said that there's no separation for Māori in terms of public art and monuments. So I'd like to understand how we would evaluate a project that Māori might bring. I often talk, and I've raised this many times before, that the European world expects Māori to work within our processes, and we don't take on board theirs. So I'm really wanting us to stretch ourselves and take on board what she said and trying to understand how they will navigate through our very European processes with this particular stuff. And I think that's it. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Councillor Angela. I've got Mayor Paula. Your comments?
Okay.
No, I had Mayor Paula. It's now disappeared.
No, that's
I've
fine.
now
'Cause
got
no, I'm
Mayor-
there. It's just moved across.
Oh.
It's a weird list. I like it better when it was coloured. It was easier to see. quite frankly.
So you haven't disappeared,
I
you're
haven't,
right
I just
here.
shifted into the speaker as opposed to request.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just a really quick couple, actually, to support the questions that Angela has raised. But I would like to do some more thinking about the alignment of relevant strategies. We've got street naming, we've got He Pō Manawa Ora, and probably others that we need to make sure are aligned and consistent as far as strategy goes. I was really taken by the idea of having some high-level principles in terms of the stories we wanted to tell, which I think Angela talked to before, so that we have some oversight about what Hamilton is and what Hamilton wants to say about itself. So obviously we have to work closely with Tangata Whenua about that as well. I was interested in the how to have that community conversation, because as I made the point, council is whoever's elected for that 3 years and the next 3 years and the next 3 years, and that can all change, and so can the views that go with it. So if we're going to have something enduring, because, you know, Angela, you do know more than, and Martin, it's been, you know, what did Nancy say? It was like doing the hokey tokey, in, out, in, out. So we've got to get this high level enough to endure the test of time, but have the bottom lines quite firm about what's not acceptable, and then let the artistic community prevail in some ways. Interesting also about the link between what we put into a policy, a panel or whatever, and the actual funding. I did think the point around publicly funded versus privately funded art is worth better exploring. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Paula. My good friend, Councillor Martin.
Sorry, there's a bit of software glitch. You can't, you try and drop off the speaking list because someone's asked a question, but I can't, is that a, I can't, if you press the button it doesn't, just if you follow.
Okay.
Yeah, just, the monument / history bit, and I'd like, just bear with me, I'd like staff to also if we could focus on the monument and the totality of our history. And for example, I will go around the town and I will see at the bottom of London Street, you know, descriptive of the first settlement of our first marae, Kerakiaroa. That's very useful. And yeah, just to differentiate between the historical, you know, the Hilda Ross, Sappermore Jones, even the War Horse is sort of what I call the historical versus the controversies around Little Bull and, you know, artwork. And I just, that's a bit of a focus because I think Mark Servian personally encapsulated a real good narrative that we need to pursue. And I really want us to pursue this in the context of the total history of this city, which did not start in the 19th century when a boat came down the river. It started much earlier, and I think that's a fundamental issue when we're talking about the words monument, all right, that we once and for all establish roughly that this city is much, much older than when the boat came down the river. And we dispense with that notion that everything happened when the boat came down the river, and I think that may be helpful. Also, if you could perhaps, you know, with regard to the, you know, the involvement of architects' landscapes, so you know what I mean, you have the artwork, forgive me, but then you have the context of good urban planning, good urban design, and how that complements a good urban space, good urban design. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Martin. And I've got Councillor Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. I won't repeat what's already been mentioned, but beyond that, I was interested in Dr. Joe Citizen's comments just around some of the wording, artistic capacity rather than merit, artworks rather than just art, those kinds of nuances, but also what he brought up in regard to maintenance concerns and whether it's the best process to just have museum staff being in charge of maintenance, or whether we need to look at that again, to ensure that there aren't barriers to having, digital art and other media used. So another issue, I guess, with the process that was has been mentioned, but I'd like to understand, how do we make sure, could we actually see what the process might look like, or how do we make sure that it is just really easy to follow for newcomers in particular. I was interested in some of the comments from, I think it was Nancy, around who should be on the panel. And so I'd be keen to have some more information come back on that, in terms of what kinds of experts that, we're wanting to have on that panel. She'd mentioned various people, including with urban design or maintenance experience, etc. So, and finally, two other things. The first one is that I was really interested in the comments from Linda around the integration of art into new building developments, and what role the policy has in terms of new buildings, and whether it can actually support us having, art that contributes to the city through new developments. And the other one is the comments from Rawiri, from Thorpe, the fact that they're not comfortable with being just part of a panel where they could be out, kind of lost within that discussion. And I don't know if they fully understand the process there, but just I'd be keen for us to have a discussion with them and work out what might actually be a process that works for them, in terms of feeling comfortable that their voice is being heard on matters. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Sarah. I've got Councillor Ryan.
Thanks, Peter. I don't know if this is slightly out of scope or not, but I just think something that could be helpful in terms of informing the, I guess, maybe not the policy, but the position of art in council, similar to the cycling, we have that ungap the map, and it identifies gaps. And I know this has been talked about previously, where there are obviously different types of art, from mural to sculpture, monument, whatever, but just to have maybe a clear understanding or an update so the public, when they're applying to be part of this process, they know what type of art is where, and where the deficiencies might be. Just that really helps if someone, so there's an organisation that wants to contribute something, they've got an ability to see the type of art that perhaps we're deficient in, and where those ideal hotspots in terms of placemaking have perhaps been pre-identified. I think that could be useful as a sort of a lens over, and it might have concentration around the CBD and then out into the suburbs, etc. But perhaps if that could find its way into our deliberations or thinking, I think that could be useful.
Thanks, Councillor Ryan. I've got Councillor Martin. Have you got
I was going to save it for debate, but I can't distend. But the two key additions, sorry, I forgot. With regard to, I'm aware Toti has not made a submission. I think I know the reasons why, but I think it would be, even though they weren't a submitter, they're been a major player. And round that, I just want to look at the balance of a panel, but keeping it simple, so that we don't unduly put impediments in the way of philanthropic groups. But I mean, obviously, Toti, I think it would be useful just to make some reference to their perspective, albeit they didn't make a submission. And then with where we're enhancing the role of the urban design panel with private developments, do they have when a building goes up, albeit it's on private property, but whether or not a panel would assist the urban design panel in terms of encouraging artistic endeavour within a particular private development as such, and whether that's just the role of the urban design panel, or whether there's just there's some expertise, or they have that expertise already.
Thanks, Councillor Martin. Now, colleagues, I need your guidance. Can I have an indication as to... Say again?
I have 5 minutes before I have
Yeah, and I'm conscious that we've got another meeting that's publicly notified at 11:30. I'm very keen for a bathroom stop, and I'm mindful that we may want to debate. So I'm just trying to get an indication as to how keen we are to debate, or if we're going to be relatively efficient. Wonderful. So we've got Councillor Angela has moved the motion, which will now miraculously appear on the board for all of us. It's been seconded by the Mayor. Councillor Angela as mover. Would you have anything in the debate? Right of
Next
reply.
couple of steps.
Okay, understood.
Or maybe right of reply if I disagree with someone.
Fair enough.
Which I'm sure I won't.
Mayor Paula, you're between. I really need the bathroom, so please be please be quick.
Important thing about this is to get this right, not rushed. Ensure it's consistent with our other strategies, plans and policies. I pick up on the point about let's have some really good conversations about Hamilton Kirikiriroa, who we are and what our stories are. But at the same time, there has to be some artistic freedom, or else much of the art that we already see in the city wouldn't be here if it hadn't popped up from the community and other people. But I'm aware there will be a range of views around art. Some will love it, some will hate harm to people. So that's the kind of lens that I want to tell fair, honest, balanced stories and help the city thrive through art would be my few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Paula. My good friend, Councillor Gallagher.
I shall be succinct as I normally am. I support the motion.
No fruit salad in that at all. I have nobody else either on Zoom. Right, so we'll put the motion. All those in favour, hands up. Those against?
The motion is carried unanimously.
Councillors, members of the public, thank you very much. We'll resume, well, the next meeting will start at 11:30. Thank you. And welcome to the Hearing and Engagement Committee, 28th of July, Traffic Matters. I have apologies, which I will move from Mayor Southgate, Councillor Pascoe, Councillor Hamilton and Councillor Nardell Ralph. Second by Councillor Max. All those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. Confirmation of the agenda. The agenda is as it appears on page 3. I'll move. Seconded by Maxine. All those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. I will move the minutes for the 21st of June 2021. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Martin. Got there just ahead of you, Maxine. Thank you. All those in favour say aye. Those against, the ayes have it. So, item number 5, parking restrictions and traffic bylaw register changes. And young Robin, we are in your hands.
Good morning, councillors. So this morning's parking restriction changes report is a reasonably simple one, as is the following item on speed limit changes, hopefully. So we have a number of parking restriction changes to reflect the continued update of our GIS system, which we've just about finished, and to also reflect changes to a couple of bus stops and results of consultation with residents where they've been having issues around parking, either close to intersections, cross driveways, that sort of thing. And the only one really of note, and primarily for your information, is some work that we've been doing to ensure that we have the correct restrictions in place for both Ward and Worley lanes, and taking out the loading zones that have been in place there and replacing them with no stopping restrictions. And that is covered on page 15 from item 14, clause 14 onwards. But apart from that, I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
All right. Colleagues, I'll open it up for questions. While we're contemplating questions, I will move, and just to get it on the table, staff recommendations on page 11.
Second.
Second by Councillor Sarah. I'm not seeing any questions, so I will move the staff's recommendation as it appears on page 11. Any debate? I see no debate. I'll move. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. That's that.
The motion is carried unanimously.
Thank you. Now moving to item 6. Robin, again, we're in your hands.
Thank you very much. So speed limit bylaw register updates. So primarily they're styled to suit a 40k restriction. So this is merely making sure we've got that legally in place for when they open to public and the development. And we have one other one which is just a slight change to make sure we have the right restriction in place, and that's just where the development's continued and we're redefining what the end of that restriction is. And that is about it. So again, I'm happy to take questions from elected members.
Questions. I've got a question from Councillor McPherson, then Councillor Gallagher, followed by Maxine.
Thanks, Chair. Robin, I thought we'd gone away from individual streets
speed limits to sort of area-wide or precinct-wide or sort of semi-automatic things. Tell me how this fits with the new speed limit process, because this seems the same as what we've always done in the past, having to pass these things after consultation at one of these meetings.
So I guess when we go back to the current speed limit bylaw, so pre-2018, every time we wanted to change a speed limit, we had to go through a special consultative process for the whole bylaw to change the speed limit.
These are new ones that weren't in the list anywhere before.
Yes, so we would have still had to have gone through that process because any new street defaults automatically to 50. So to have anything other than that, we would have had pre-2018, we would have had gone through that special consultative process. Could have taken up to 6 months to get it in place. 2018, we did a couple of things. We altered the bylaw to allow changes to the registers via resolution, and this committee has the delegation to do that.
Which is what we're doing now.
And the other thing that we did was we went through a special consultative procedure to develop and adopt the speed management plan, which set out what we saw the speed limits being long-term across the city for the existing network, but we also put some principles in place and said if we have some new roads that come along, residential streets, for example, will be 40. At the moment, we still need to just go through, and so we haven't gone out and done consultation on these. We've basically just brought them through to the committee. They're new streets, there's nobody lives down there yet, or they're in the process of building, but it's in accordance with our speed management plan. So it's a lot quicker process. When the new speed limits rule comes into effect, which they're hoping end of this year, then that will result in another set of changes as well. And then we can start looking at those
That's the
areas.
nationwide NZTA
Correct.
change.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's when we'll be able to look at actually be able to draw areas and go everything in this area changes. So it's coming, it's not quite here yet.
Okay, good. Are we able to easily retrospectively do stuff with the current situation, current set of rules we have? I'm thinking, well, here's an example, I'm thinking there are still problems in K Road, because it's still, K Road, while it's an old road, is also a new road on our side of the boundary, and has a lot of construction going on there at the moment, and new houses going up on the road, literally that come in off the road.
Yes.
In some cases.
Yes.
Or streets that come off the road and all sorts of bits.
Yes, so we're certainly able to work through. It depends what we've got in that speed management plan. Spoiler alert, I'm intending to gather up a list of sites where we probably want to do something slightly different to what we had in the speed management plan. And I'm intending to try and work that through a future infrastructure ops committee and go out through special consultative process to update that speed management plan and include a few extra items that we need in there in preparation for this rule change that we've got coming, because the rule change they're hoping will be end of this calendar year. That, if everything goes according to what was written, will result in the need to develop regional speed management plans, but they are obviously going to take a little bit of time. So they have got an allowance in there for our interim speed management plans that we can get approved by Waka Kotahi and allow us to carry on doing fairly similar to what we've been doing, noting that we're really the only ones in the country doing it this way. So I want to just update that speed management plan and make sure I've got all the right components in that, so that when that rule changes, we're ready to go and have that sort of interim ability prior to the regional one coming. So, and that will give us that opportunity to pick up a few of those ones that we now look at and go, actually, second thoughts, I'd like to change that.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair, for allowing that.
Thank you, Councillor Dev. Councillor Gallagher.
Yeah, no, I think you've answered. So basically, with the new rule changes, you have an area, and it's what I call the retro review of the
Yes.
I mean, look, clear interest obviously because I own a property down in Anglesey Street. But, you know, we've done the engineering and I think it's, at the moment, I think it's still 50, which is a bit bizarre. And then my brain says, why would it even be 40? It would be obviously, given the nature of the street, it would be a 30. And there are a number of streets, frankly, that would be 30s. But I'm just trying to, you know, like, but it's a sort of, it's the retrofit and retro view. Is that what you really...
That's what I intend to pick up with this review later in the year, because Ward Street, for example, is one that when we set up that speed management plan, we hadn't incorporated a lower speed limit in Ward Street or perhaps Ross Trevor Street. So, you know, the benefit of hindsight. Back in 2018 when we did it, it was probably pretty good, and actually, you know, most things have worked out really well, and I think this process has been nicely streamlined.
So that's
but we will have a look back and look at what other changes.
Presumably then you'll talk, we may not have the money, but you'll talk about engineering issues. So another street that I'm familiar with, declaration of interest, is McFarlane Street, where we correctly have the 40k, but the design of the road doesn't encourage that behaviour. Is that so? I guess, you know, there's two things. These streets should be this limit, and then across here for future budget considerations, these streets need to have some retro engineering fitted into them. Does that?
Yes, we're always, you know, we do have a small pool of funding for the speed changes, and we're spreading the marmite as we can. Yeah. But yes, that's all that opportunity to have a look at that, and you know, again, looking at those principles and making sure that we're all set up for moving forward.
And just forgive me, with the schools and you know, like we have the flashy signs, 40, but there's more leeway for the speeds to come down further around the schools. Is that, will that require us to bylaw to enable those electronic signs to reduce to 30 or whatever, where if, you know, whatever is decided?
So, in exec update this week, there you would have noticed there was a small article in there about Hamilton City being part of a trial of a new signage regime for 30k's past schools. The intention is that trial will run through to the end of this calendar year, again to help inform when that new rule comes out. Our speed management plan had already set out a desire to, and stated the desire to get 30k's past schools. And so, again, when that rule comes out in the new year, we'll have that ability to roll out more of those 30k's for schools.
That gives us flexibility and ability. Just a final question. I'm sorry again to quote a street that I'm familiar with. Palmerston Street, we did a lot of great engineering works. We have very high density settlement in that area. We have the proximity of Hamilton West School Hospital. The normal, with the engineering, it's saying to you, singing out 40k, albeit still a principal street and a link street. Is that kind of those kind of streets going to be up for debate?
Yes, that is definitely one that's on the list. That in 2018 we hadn't thought of the work that we have just recently done in Palmerston Street, with the major pavement rehab project that was going through. It was a classic opportunity to put back something that was a bit different and more appropriate. So that will be one of the streets that will change, because our speed management plan currently shows that as being 50. That will be our opportunity to signal that we want to move it to 40 and take it through that consultation process.
Thank you.
Councillor Maxine.
Thank you, Robin. I see that the developer will be covering the cost of signage in those areas. Great to be able to see that. Is that signage just the ring 40s? You know, because I know that in the past we've spray painted a number on the street so that when you get up in the morning, drive out of your driveway, you encounter the 40 there rather than when you're coming into the area. Will that cover any of that kind of work?
For most of these streets, we're only looking at the signage. Again, I guess the idea is that they're designed and feel and look and operate appropriately. Where we've been having to spray the paint is where we're retrofitting those older streets where they're often really wide and don't have any of those sort of calming devices in amongst them. So in the future, we may have to go back and retrofit, but most of these ones are, you know, they're fairly short in nature, and I don't think they'll be needed to have that paint.
Okay, look, you just triggered something else in my head. Having been on recently a trip to Christchurch to have a look at some of their neighbourhood streets and cycle lanes, they have a greenway that they call, which they then paint a cycle and the kind of the sharing of the road, and that again reminds drivers mostly that there's other people around, and particularly cyclists. Might that be an opportunity in those, if they are smaller streets, to be able to you know, bring that kind of treatment in as well?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the sort of thing that fits very much within that biking and micromobility program of work, recognising the different hierarchies of roads, and for those local streets, it will be those sorts of things to remind
but that won't be happening in this
not as part of the speed
scheme?
limit process, no.
No, okay. And then, so finally, is the notion of courtesy and education of road users. Can you remind me about what kind of responsibility we have around that, or what the developer might have around being able to ensure that there's an understanding in those sort of new developments and streets?
So I guess from the developer's perspective, it is fairly much the infrastructure, and it is actually making sure that, I mean, these new streets look and feel very different to those that were built 10 years ago or beyond that. So that's creating that sort of self-explaining environment with the infrastructure, so that the driver doesn't actually need to think too much about it, it just becomes natural. We have, through our road safety education program and that sort of thing, ongoing work that we do for speed and all sorts of other activities as well. So we're funded through that to do that sort of work.
And that we get a subsidy from
Correct.
Waka Kotahi for
Correct.
that work?
Yes.
All right, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
You're welcome. Councillor Dave.
Sorry, I had another question that arose during the discussion. At one point, Robin, you said that developers that are working on new areas are themselves responsible for building the streets to the right look and feel for the 40k, if that's what's proposed for the area. Does that happen at the, or are they told about that at the first point they come into us? I'm thinking, for instance, of little WA area, which is not even in the city yet, but is proposed to come into the city, and they're already doing planning for development. Will an outfit like that be told when they make their approach to us? Is there some hook that ensures that they don't ever design something that might be suitable for Waikato District, but knowing it's going to be ours eventually?
So the two key documents, I guess, the primary one is the district plan, which talks about local streets having a speed limit of 40. And then the regional, so it's a regional document, the Regional Infrastructure Technical Specification, which we call RIT, so you can understand why. That also has a lot of information in it, and talks about the sorts of components that you need to have in place to create that 40k environment as well. And that's like, you know, forward distance, the width of the road, the width of the lanes, and that sort of thing.
So I'm thinking even further ahead, there's a crowd out that are looking at developing the Burton block way outside the city to eventually be part of it. Will they've got professional planners, I'm sure, working for them already. Will they, as a matter of course, know about that they'll have to design it like that before they ever get pen to paper almost?
They should. Certainly we have early engagement with our developers, and we do a lot of work with our developers.
It's more the worry about those ones around the outside.
Yes. So I assume that Waikato District are also having those discussions, and that infrastructure technical specification is a Waikato region document.
Does that specify 40k suburban streets? for local roads?
It probably doesn't say that they have to, but I know that Waikato District through Gareth Bellamy has been doing a lot of work in that area, so they're very active in the whole speed management area as
Is
well.
that something that we ought to maybe be able to be more definite about, so that there's an agreement, part of our agreement with Waikato District and Waipa might be that if this is an area that's known to be under discussion of future coming to the city, that it's actually our specifications that they're for traffic management that they're looking at rather than their own?
Quite possibly, that's something I'd have to talk to the likes of Blair and those sorts of folks, I guess, that are having that high level discussion, but I'm certainly happy to follow
I'm sure
that up.
someone like Gareth from the Waikato District will be okay, but what about when he's not there?
Yeah, yeah.
When he's not there or something
Yeah,
like
no, I can certainly follow up and
yeah.
I'm not sure what agreements we've got at that higher level sort of growth discussion, so yeah, well, I can ask the question.
Thanks.
Now I've got Councillor Sarah, but Councillor Dave, did you want just a minute note for that?
That'd be helpful if we added that in to check on our arrangements with the neighbouring councils about future areas coming into Hamilton and what traffic management rules are going to be applied to those developments, if that
would be great
before they come into the city.
So staff, are you happy with that? And Robin, that gives you something to pin back and so that will come back to us.
Yes.
Great. Councillor Sarah?
Thank you, Chair. Robin, talking about RITs, we, in a past, I think it was a past infrastructure committee meeting, we recently we had a discussion around the need to have clear design guidelines, but also to be potentially well, I don't know how far it went, but I asked about updating RITs to be reflecting future needs in terms of particularly the biking micromobility plan. Where are things at with that? Because have we got that coming back to us at some point?
I don't know. I know that the RITS is a document that does continue to need to be updated. I'm also aware that Waka Kotahi, for example, are doing some design guides and bits and pieces. So there's quite a lot of work sort of happening. And then there's also there's two what we call traffic control design devices manuals. So that we have the traffic control devices rule, which is all that sort of technical stuff, but then there are two manuals that sit below that, one being at intersections and the other being between intersections, and they have recently gone through an awful lot of work to make sure that they're also reflecting the latest guidance around particularly cycle facilities. So Axel Wilkie, for example, has been heavily involved in that work. So there are a number of documents coming through. And I know that certainly our development team look very closely at all the engineering plans when they come through to make sure that we are getting the right sort of standards. What I would say is in most cases the developments we're getting of new roads are your local residential streets, so they won't have a large amount of cycling infrastructure on them. It tends to be council that is building those bigger roads or retrofitting those bigger roads where we're going to see that separated cycling facilities coming through. But I can ask for an update and find out what's happening.
Okay, I think that would be really useful, and just building on from what Maxine was saying, even when you're looking at your smaller residential roads, you ideally would want 30 kilometres an hour max if you're having people biking and scootering and things along that road. And they have those kind of low traffic neighbourhoods, basically, the greenways. And I think with new developments, the last thing that we want to be doing going forward is retrofitting. So if we're able to be linking in how new developments actually integrate into the biking micromobility plan now, and ensuring that even if it's not a main arterial or it doesn't have it absolutely separated, lane or anything, that it's at least a greenway with that restricted traffic flow. I think that's really important because retrofitting is not fun, particularly once communities are already used to what they've got.
Councillor Sarah, would you like to try to formalise that at all with a minute note again? Or are you,
Robin, what's your thinking in terms of to have that come back to us? Is that something, a conversation for the what committee is that? For growth or infrastructure?
I think it's probably infrastructure ops, and it fits within Martin Park sort of area, particularly for the biking component of it. So yeah, I'm happy to sort of pass that on, and it may be an update in the GM's report, and or it's probably some sort of workshop at some stage with elected members on that.
Okay, so some kind of staff action noted around coming back to us on new areas, ensuring new areas future-proofed in terms of the biking micromobility program, something along those lines.
Governance has sort of has guided me to suggest that maybe we could go as far as Robin committing to raise that as you have and pass that on, because otherwise it falls somewhat outside of our parameter here. So could we leave it at that, Sarah? Robin's undertaken to pass it on, and I have no doubt you will follow that up with her. Cool. Councillor Martin.
Yes, I'm not sure. You'll have to rule, Mr. Chair. I was going to ask through you to Councillor Van Oosten for her to confirm with Councillor McPherson that I was cycling all over Christchurch. Is that in the scope of our meeting?
Well, I think it is a matter of absolute public interest.
Yeah.
So in which case, yes, Councillor Maxine, please.
We have photographic evidence.
Right. I think in light of that, that needs to be circulated.
Was it a mini bike?
But on a serious note,
An assisted ride.
I totally respect, we're straying slightly, and I totally respect the scope of this committee, but certainly through the chair, obviously very much looking forward in another room to kind of that ongoing dialogue in terms of some of the Christchurch experience, which is very valid.
In a belated attempt to try to get this back on track, I'm happy to move the staff recommendation on page 38. Second by Councillor Sarah. Can I open it up to debate? I have no debate. Councillor Martin.
We know you cycled around.
The only thing I just say, notwithstanding being inspired by another city, which I was, I'm certainly still very much inspired by Robin Denton and her team and what we are doing in Hamilton. And I think the questioning, I realise we're only regulatory at this point, but in terms of the way ahead, I think there's going to be some really good dialogue to make the place, bringing that 20-minute city, bringing that safe, friendly city, and certainly just make those points. Having said that, I found Robin's answers to our questions actually very useful in this case.
Right, well, no other questions. Let's put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Those against?
The motion is carried unanimously.
Colleagues, that brings the meeting to an end. Thank you very much.